Welcome everyone to the penultimate session of the RDI Exchange, and delighted to be here and able to chair this important session that will bring all of the issues together and solve all of the concerns and problems and questions that you have. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to their elders past and present, and also pay respects to all First Nations people, both here and online. The session topic for this final session, as I said, it will bring everything together. It'll be the one ring that rules them all and binds them, is the changing development landscape. As you all know, as there's been discussion, there's 4 years to go until the target year for the SDGs. And as you would have heard this morning, there's possibly a potential for a new era of development cooperation, that the sector perhaps has the level of maturity in order to make the changes that need to be made, and to, dare I say it, take advantage of the constraints and challenges that the sector is facing in order to craft that new world. And that's partly what we're going to be trying to cover today with our speakers. I should also remind you that the Hoover app, WOVA app, please take advantage of that, because after the initial discussion and questions with the panel, we'll be wanting to hear from you with your questions. And don't forget to upvote questions that you think are really important that we need to hear, just in case we run out of time. So in order to discuss this important question, provide in some respects a synthesis of what we've been hearing about for the last 2 days, the organisers, and may I also give another shout out and thank you to the organising team for what they've put together. The organisers have put together an incredible panel for today. I'll introduce them briefly. You can of course read full bios on the WOVA app. But starting from the end, we have Professor Robin Davies, an honorary professor at the ANU's Crawford School in the Development Policy Centre at ANU, but a huge experience, over 2 decades of senior leadership experience in international development, both with Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and AusAid before that, including leading the program for the humanitarian response to the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. But Robin is also on many boards looking at development and health, and has a strong research record as well, particularly in development finance and policy matters. We're also really pleased to have to my left here, Joe Cho, who's Managing Director of DT Global Asia Pacific. And as you all will know, DT is one of the largest implementing partners for Australian International Development Program. And Joe is also Deputy Chair of the International Development Contractors Community Board, the peak body representing those organisations, and has been there from the very beginning of that organisation, in fact. And Joe spent 15 years managing development assistance to DFAT, including particularly in the Pacific, and the response to tropical cyclone Winston in Fiji. So we also have Matthew Murray, who's Chief Executive Officer of ACFID, and we owe a huge debt of gratitude to ACFID, not just for their work generally, but specifically for their support over the many years for in partnership with with this RDI organisation and conference. So Matthew's stepped into the role as CEO quite relatively recently, after being CEO for 16 years of Tier Fund Australia, and also has significant on-the-ground experience in the development sector, particularly in Africa, and with as the inaugural chair of the Emergency Action Alliance and the board of Micro Australia and Make Poverty History. So welcome, Matthew. And here we have Shirin Malikpour, Associate Professor and Director of the Graduate Research Program at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. I'm happy to say a sister organisation of ISF, so we're really pleased to have Shirin here. and her colleagues. And Sharon is led programs on localising the SDGs, so very topical for this particular session, in partnership with governments, international organisations and NGOs. Sharon's been recognised as one of the 25 young scientists globally in the field of sustainable development, and has also received the International Green Talents Award. And she's, prior to working at Monash and in academia, she's worked directly on infrastructure projects in Africa and the Middle East. So welcome to all of you. I think you'll agree that's both an incredibly deep and broad panel, and very appropriate for the topic that we have. So I'm just going to ask some questions of the panel first, but I would remind you to make sure that you are putting your questions, whatever prompts come up from that discussion, just to make sure that we can get rich discussion, and particularly in light of what you've heard over the last 2 days, that would be really important. So, Joe, I actually want to start with you, if that's okay. And you've been involved in a range of different parts of the Australian development sector, both in AusAid previously and now with DT Global. And I wonder what is, just to sort of start painting the picture of the key trends that have shaped the sector over the last 5 years, and then perhaps importantly, what directions you see for the future.
Right. Thanks, Stuart. I guess it's a very big question, so I'll sort of treat this as a context-setting approach of putting out a couple of ideas, and really want to hear from others as well in the room. I guess I thought about two ways to look at it, two key trends, and then also the interaction between those two trends. I think the first one is really about the conceptualization of who we are as development cooperation actors, what that actually means, and a bit of a reckoning and an understanding that we're not the main characters in the story, that we're playing a supportive and enabling and facilitating role. I think that this thinking has really emerged out of a lot of dialogue and discourse around decolonisation, around locally led development. I think it's really dominated the discussions here at this conference and at many conferences in the past few years on development. And I think it's received recognition in the international development policy in terms of how Australia is seeing itself as a development partner, with a real emphasis on what it means to be a good partner, what it means to support locally led development, and how Australia needs to play a supporting and facilitating role around that. So not to say that we're there yet, but to say that this dialogue, this understanding has certainly emerged, is strengthening. There's a policy basis for it now. And I think that increasingly we can see programming and incentives and action around this thinking. So that's definitely one key trend. I think on the other hand, another key trend over the last 5 years has certainly been around the geostrategic context, the security agenda, and the very clear view that international development is a tool in the toolbox of diplomacy and foreign policy for Australia. And this has definitely shaped the way that international development cooperation is being understood, is being practiced and programmed. And we see that through a real emphasis on highly visible outputs and a real focus on public diplomacy. And it's affecting programming in ways where we're seeing, for example, an increase in things like infrastructure investment in the Pacific region, for instance. So I think those two key trends are very dominant to me. That's what I see. And the way they interact, obviously there's a lot of conflict between those two key trends. And I think going forward and into the future, that the way those two tensions play out and the way that they interact with each other is going to continue to shape development in the next few years. But I think one interesting area is where we're seeing a little bit of convergence between those two agendas. And that's the really interesting bit to me. So just for example, in the infrastructure space, And we implement a lot of infrastructure programs in the region, for instance. Infrastructure is something that Australia wants to be doing well, is investing a lot in. There's other actors that also invest in a lot of infrastructure. Australia is starting to see its comparative advantage in infrastructure in how it does it, in a way that supports local actors, supports local economies, creates local jobs, draws on local suppliers, creates business opportunities in local economies. So I think that the way that we do things and the way that we work can support locally led approaches at the same time, sometimes at the same time as meeting other agendas that are going on. And that's one area where I'm seeing that.
Thanks very much, Joe. I'd like to just follow on with that theme about the geostrategic changes and that tension that you mentioned, and come to you, Robin, with if you could delve into that a little as well. I mean, it's not an elephant in the room, but it hasn't been a great year for international development with the US cutting aid. And we were just talking earlier about the ripple effects of that and significant reductions in budget in the UK and even elsewhere in Europe. But at the same time, we've had recent elections, and we could be seen to be weathering the storm. And so following on from what Joe was just saying, how do you think these global forces will impact Australian development assistance, and what can we expect to see over the next 4 to 5 years?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Just first on that, the global context. So one of the jobs I had a long time ago had me sitting on the OECD Development Assistance Committee, and you'd sort of see cycles. Certain donors would, for domestic reasons, would vary their budget significantly. But I've never seen anything like this. So 4 of the world's largest donors, who make up about 60% of global aid, even more for least developed countries, have all cut their budgets simultaneously and have all made it very clear that they're going to keep doing that, at least for the next few years. And there's, on top of those 4, you've got Japan and Italy, who certainly can't be counted on. They're just being a bit quiet about their intentions at the moment. And then you've got a whole host of smaller donors who are also cutting. There's about 11 donors out of the 32 OECD donors who are cutting, including most of the big ones. And the collective impact of that, we've seen it this year, 7% cut from 23 to 24. We'll probably see another 17 to 25% cut next year. So within a couple of years, global aid could be, 25, 30% below its peak, its 2023 peak. So this is a really big deal. We haven't seen anything like this for decades. So just to really underline that point. And, the way it looks to me is that at least the OECD aid system is in the early stages of dismantling itself. We don't need to call for it to be dismantled. I think it's kind of heading in that direction. But we should be careful what we wish for. What we're seeing at the same time is a number of emerging donors, and that even includes Russia. Hilariously, Russia is in the process of establishing an aid agency on the model of USAID. Maybe it's looking at that employment pool, I don't know. But Russia, China, some of the Arab states, Turkey, Brazil, are all in the process of strengthening or establishing agencies on the old model of OECD aid agencies. So it's not that the system is necessarily collapsing, it's that some of the characters in the system are moving around, and I think it's important to be aware of that. Now coming to the impact of, the likely impact of all of that on Australian aid over the next few years, I think, one thing we can be absolutely certain of is that Australia's aid to the Pacific region is going to be at the very least stable. That's the last thing that will ever change. It's already at a couple of $2 billion in total flows terms to the Pacific every year. So the volume of that and probably the size of country allocations is very unlikely to change whatever happens. That's a rock. But the sectoral focus of that aid is a whole different question. The government has clear climate change expenditure commitments and is under pressure from the electorate domestically and from partner governments in the Pacific to do more and more in climate adaptation, in particular in the Pacific. And this is part of the reason for that shift towards infrastructure that Joe talked about. A lot of these infrastructure investments can be scored as climate aid. And that obviously tends to come at the expense of social sector expenditure, health and education expenditure. So I think with the protection of the Pacific and the protection or expansion of climate aid, I think we're clearly going to see a drift towards the hard sectors in the region. Let me get out my notes. By the way, when I got my little piece of paper at the beginning, which was ripped out of the book, I got the title page. I'm not sure what that means. So just two quick final points. If we see, it's very unclear whether the total volume of Australian aid will change. If it does diminish, even while protecting those two things I've talked about, there's a couple of ways this could go. One is that you see a sort of obsessive concern about efficiency, getting more for less, accountability to taxpayers. And in that scenario, you sort of get a doubling down on the projectized approach to aid, and you get, more of that sort of theory of change approach to aid design, which a lot of people here have talked about as excessively rigid. In science, we don't expect theses to be right. In aid, somehow we do. But I don't think things will go that way. Even if aid diminishes, I think what we're more likely to see is a convergence of two interests, not quite the ones that Joe was talking about. On the one hand, we have people who think aid should all be about furthering geostrategic objectives. And on the other hand, we have people who want to see aid increasingly localized, who want to see greater country ownership, the sort of thing we used to talk about in the DAC years ago. And I think there is a convergence of interests to some extent there, because at least in terms of government to government aid, localization means budget support above all. That's what governments want, whether at the national level or at the provincial level. They want more budget support and less projectized aid with those advisors wandering around Port Moresby. So I think you will probably see an increasing amount of budget support alongside that increasing infrastructure investment. And I think that's not a bad thing. And of course, from a DFAT perspective, it has the advantage that it's also a lot cheaper to run. So I think those are some of the impacts I would expect.
Great. Thanks, Robin. And we'll definitely return shortly to that question about locally led development, both for you and for other panelists. Matthew, I'd like to come to you next and your constituency, NGOs, and to what we've just talked about, what we've heard from Robin and from Joe, but focused on the NGO sector and what you think are the key issues facing your constituents, members, the NGO sector at the moment in relation to what we've heard.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'll start by echoing what Robin said about the scale of disruption. Having been in the sector from the NGO perspective for about 30 years now, there hasn't been kind of this scale of disruption in this period of time, at least from my perspective. So, and certainly as we talk to our members, the 136 agencies that are members of ACFID, that's a regular discussion about how impactful this last 6 months has been. I think, and we can think of it at a couple of different levels. I do want to talk about the impacts of the USAID cuts because they've been so material and they were kind of the impetus for a lot of the disruption. But as Robin said, they mirror kind of trends that are happening more widely. As we did a survey of our members early on in the after the cuts had been announced, and this is an incomplete number, and it's up on our website, the actual data, but it was something around $300 million worth of programs for Australian NGOs, which were directly impacted by those cuts. And somewhere around 20 offices, country office level programs that had to be shut down as well. If you look a little bit more widely, and you talk to some of our members who have big global federations, they were talking on the score of 3,000 staff being let go. But I was just checking this morning, there's a few different websites who track impact and are kind of watchdogs on the USAID cuts, and their number was up to 233,000 jobs globally that have ended, that have all ended because of these cuts. And it's not just the direct cuts to programs, but it's the cuts to multilateral funding and other programs that have been funded by USAID. So massive impacts. And certainly I'm talking about Australian NGOs, but when we did the survey, part of what we were looking at was the impact on local NGOs. And the impact is similar in the sense of country offices shut, and often actually more extreme, because while many NGOs, Australian NGOs do have reserves and ability to maybe weather some of these storms, albeit difficult, a lot of local organizations and local partners weren't in that position, and so faced significant challenges in terms of programs shut on the day. I do think for the sector, the last 6 months, it's been hard to kind of raise your gaze and say, what are the bigger strategic, how do we go forward from here? And we're just getting to that point. We had a summit in June where we called together about 70 of the leaders from our member organizations to talk about what are the emerging kind of areas of focus, what does the next season look like? And certainly every one of our members has in some way had to take their strategic plan off the shelf and say, we need to revisit this and think differently because of the significance of the change. But as we talk about the change, and one of the things that many of us will have read is there are narratives saying actually the great thing about the scale of this change is it actually does allow us to kind of dismantle the system and reinvent it in ways that could be better and can address a lot of the themes that we've been talking about since yesterday. And I do agree with that. I think it's an opportunity for us to think differently. But at the same time, there's a risk of losing sight of the people who are impacted in the midst of this. I've been having a chat exchange with someone who lives in in Cox's Bazar, in the Rohingya refugee camp, and just hearing about the impact on their lives, and the message that he sent through the other day, just saying, they're down to 1 meal a day. They're really, all the different ways you can think of them struggling, because about half of the funding for the refugee situation there has been impacted. And many of you will have seen the reporting in the New York Times and other places tracking, is it 14 million or how many people will die this year because of those aid cuts. So while I do think it's an opportunity to reinvent the system, I think it would be bad if we lose sight of the fact that there are people who are directly impacted by the way these reductions have been made. So part of our advocacy back to the bigger system and to ODA and to governments in Europe and others who are being more thoughtful, I will say, or at least having a longer time frame for the change, is to think about the human cost as we do implement these changes and we think about the reforms that could take place. As I mentioned, we had the summit in June with our member CEOs, and a few themes emerged that I'll touch on now and happy to come back to in the question time. One of which I think we'll spend more time on anyway as a panel, is just the question of decolonization and locally led. That's been a theme for the sector. ACFID's done a lot of work supporting our members on that. And if you went to our website, you can see some very practical tools about what that looks like and how you can kind of measure your organization or your way of thinking in regard to where you are on that journey. But a discussion has been, how do we make sure that in the midst of resources being so tightly constrained, the NGOs don't pull more money away from the local partners and local organizations? So how do we be thoughtful about the transition? There has been a real shift as well to say, actually, if, as Robin's foreshadowed, we're talking about global cuts of unprecedented levels across all of ODA. Well, then what are different ways of thinking about making an impact? And the conference the last day and a half have talked about some of these things, but certainly thinking about systems change like tax reform and dealing with debt and thinking about remittances as a funding flow and different ways of thinking about how do we fund the system away from just ODA. And then also some discussions, and I'll end it here, on new partnerships and new ways of thinking. So how do we work with philanthropy, something that ACFID's been actively doing with the Philanthropy Australia, and they have a subset, which is AIDN, the Australian International Development Network, which is the philanthropists in Australia who are particularly interested in international development issues, but working with them to say, how do we think differently? How do we plug gaps, but the quantum's not going to ever be plugged by what can be drawn in. But how do we think differently about partnerships going forward? How do we think about blended finance in different ways? How do we think about university partnerships in ways that can bring about transformational development? And finally, how do we think about working in different ways with diaspora communities, which is something that actually some of our ACFID members are particularly focused on that, but it's an area where there's a lot more potential. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Matthew. And it'd be great later we might have an opportunity to elaborate on some of those things that you ended with, and particularly encourage at this point people to put some questions into the WOVA app. So I mentioned earlier about the SDGs. We've got just over less than 5 years before the 2030 target for the SDGs. And so over to you, Sharon, because the last 5 years you've been involved in many high-level discussion. I know your colleagues from MSDI have also been centrally involved in the SDGs, and thank you for your work in that area. And particularly looking at how to accelerate the progress towards achieving these. And I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on what you see the function of these kind of global commitments in this space, and just hypothesize about the SDGs. What's the future of that? And I know you and your colleagues will have thought a lot about that. And are there opportunities to do things differently, riffing off what we've just been talking about, this potential pivot point that we have in front of us? And if so, what do you think these things that we could do differently are?
Thanks. I should say that I probably see two key functions for a framework like the SDGs. One is that really for the first time in the history of sustainable development, we actually have a set of time-bound, measurable goals that give us a clear direction about where we want to be heading. We have been talking about sustainable development for a few decades now, but there has been different views on what do we mean by sustainable development, and where are we actually heading, what does it mean in terms of actual implementation and action. So for the first time, we have a set of goals that actually tell us where we need to get. And there's a timeline attached to it, although we are lagging way behind that timeline, but there is a timeline that could help potentially create that sense of urgency. Now, it hasn't worked quite like that, and I'll get back to that. The second function of the SDGs is that I think it really helps us see issues in a very interconnected way. And if you look at the goals, it covers everything that we really need and care for. No poverty, quality education, good health, equalities, climate action, protecting our environment. So everything is in there, and it is there in one framework. And I think that really helps us really see that these issues are interlinked and need to be tackled in an interlinked way. So you made comments, both Joe and Robin, about infrastructure projects, and you talk about job promotion through that, so doing more than just implementing an infrastructure. And you raised a question about what about health and education, and we should make sure it doesn't come at the expense of health and education. And I think if we really were implementing and thinking about how to work with this framework, the framework of the SDGs, that could help us, really consider these issues a little bit more thoughtfully and carefully. Now, about the future of the SDGs, I think, the SDGs are talking about, basically they exist. They came about because there were serious gaps in the way we were doing things, and there were serious issues that needed to be resolved, from poverty to health and education to climate, etc. So they exist because of a reason. And those issues are not going to go away overnight. Actually, if anything, in some areas, we might be going backwards, and issues are getting actually more severe. So whether we have a framework that is called the Sustainable Development Goals or not, I think that doesn't really matter. You can call it a different name. You can call it a well-being framework, for example. We are really talking about the outcomes that we want, and the outcomes that we want and the outcomes that the SDGs envision and talk about, those are going to last, and they're going to be staying there, and we have to tackle them. That is not going to change. Now, the other part of your question about how do we do things differently going forward. One of the things we are actually doing at the Institute, at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, is that we are coordinating, convening a group of research institutions globally from all over the world, including global North and South, where they have really worked on the issues of SDG implementation over the past decade. And then trying to say, now, what have we really learned from the past 10 years of working on the SDGs and trying to advocate for achieving the SDGs? Let's reflect on that and then think about what needs to change, particularly in the post-2030 agenda. Because with 5 years to go, we really need to be organizing from now in order to be able to influence that post-2030 agenda as a group of thought leaders, or at least the way we want to call ourselves. And in that, one of our recent discussions, we had a workshop in Jakarta where we all got together and we were discussing these issues. One of the key things that actually came out from that meeting was that we really need a clear theory of change for the SDGs. Because the SDGs were basically developed by member states, or say pretty much driven by the UN and UN agencies, and they were signed up to by member states. And the kind of implicit assumption underlying the SDGs was that you basically set these goals and then hopefully, all different societal actors will rally behind them and go on and implement them, and then we will transform our world. That was what the document was called, Transforming Our World. Well, it hasn't turned out quite that way. So we are saying that we need to now develop a clear theory of change for the SDGs. And I really want to emphasize that I think I really want to advocate for a bigger role and a more proactive role from civil society organizations in really helping informing that theory of change and then influencing the post-2030 agenda. Because what is happening really on the ground is that, particularly in the Asia Pacific, we have all these governments, and through my work with the UN, I really engage with these national level policymakers who are all over the SDGs. They love the SDGs, they use it in all their languages and development policy documents, and they set up committees and task forces to implement the SDGs. They're really interested. But when it comes to implementation, the way governments are organized through their departments, it's very compartmentalized. So they actually cannot do that interconnected consideration that is needed for implementing the SDGs. Whereas, on the other hand, local actors, civil society organizations, development practitioners, people in this room, they probably see things actually a lot more interconnected. But they probably haven't been very proactive in making the best use of this global framework, and then also putting their stamp on it and say, what is our role, and how can we be more proactive in actually being part of that theory of change. So I really hope that that can change in the post-2030 agenda, and we see a more prominent role for local actors when it comes to the next Sustainable Development Agenda.
Thanks, Shirin. If I could come back to you, Joe, if we could go down to the next level of what you think that Australian development organisations and other stakeholders need to change in order to tackle what we've just been hearing about, in order to tackle these current and future changes?
There are a lot of things. I guess in terms of what we are talking about in terms of locally led development, I think there's a lot that needs to happen for the sector and all of the actors in the sector to truly embrace that way of working and that approach and behaviour. I think everything from our systems and processes and rules where there are certain things that are required, and there's room in every situation where you can find different ways of working and different approaches that are going to further locally led development or not. So I think we need to be able to take those opportunities to make those very practical changes and reforms that are going to make those outcomes a reality. And we need people to be coming to those problems with that mindset and that motivation to make it happen and to see locally led development as the outcome and the goal that we're all working towards. I think that if we do that, then we can continue to keep finding ways to inch forward and find different ways that we can progress things. And I think just talking to people here over the last couple of days, I've heard examples of where people have done that or tried to do that. Sometimes they've succeeded, sometimes they haven't. And I think it's going to be that kind of collective effort that helps bring about some of those changes. I think the other area is also something that's come up a lot at this conference, which is around the overarching narrative of what development actually is. I think that is in a state of flux. And I think the old paradigm has been challenged. And I think that there is new and emerging ideas, different practices, but I think everybody is struggling in many ways to put the right words around it and be able to talk about it convincingly and in a way that brings other people along. We're a sector that is well known for our jargon. It's sort of impenetrable most of the time at best. So I think when we saw something like what happened in the US occur, I mean, one of the most disturbing things I think was some of the public reaction. And there was a lot of misinformation out there about what it was that aid was or wasn't doing. But I think it goes to this need for a bit more emphasis and prioritisation of what that narrative is and the effort we all put into communicating that in our own countries and communities, as well as with our partners across the region.
Right. Thanks, Jo. So, Robin, just continuing on this line about locally led development and what you think from the point of view of official donors and how they think about their roles with respect to locally led development. How important is that in terms of these global shifts, and how do you see that playing out from the point of view of official donors?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. So if the question is, does this global shift in development financing and combined with the focus on localization, where does that take us?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things there. I touched on budget support before in the context of Australian aid, but I think, more generally, the current circumstances should desirably move donors towards a stronger emphasis on budget support in the right circumstances and away from projectized assistance. Secondly, I think turning sort of to the multilateral system, there will clearly be less OECD donor cash going into some of the major multilateral development funds and programs, including things like the Global Fund and Gavi. We've seen the projected impacts already. So those organizations will have less cash to dispense to developing countries. At the same time, they don't just exist to dispense cash. They have all sorts of useful functions, depending on which organization you're talking about. But aggregating demand, shaping markets to reduce prices for developing countries for things like vaccines and drugs and medical devices, setting standards, and providing technical assistance. A non-health example would be the Mekong River Commission, which we heard about earlier today. So these organizations, collective action is always going to be useful. So even if they have less donor cash to dispense, they still provide very useful services to developing countries. And I think we will see many developing countries increasingly contributing to these organizations or, purchasing commodities through them because of those features that they offer. And the more that happens, the more the governance of these organizations has got to change and has got to give greater voice and power to non-traditional donors. So I think there will be changes on the multilateral front. Thirdly, on humanitarian assistance, we've seen just over the last year, and I think for the next year or two, it's clear that there will be disproportionate cuts to humanitarian allocations. And that's partly, inherently these allocations are kept flexible by donors. They need to be flexible. So they're also easy to cut because they're so flexible. So I hope that the impact on humanitarian allocations will be a short-term thing. But I think it's important that the development community keeps a strong focus on that, and that governments experience pressure to, in the long run, make sure that humanitarian funding, whether it's emergencies or protracted crises, is at least maintained at current levels after what I hope is a short dip. Thirdly, if you've got a lot less money, then the world will have a lot less ODA, that's for sure. What are the most strategic investments that you can make? A lot of the conversation tends to be about government-to-government bilateral aid. But when you really think about it, many of the things that have the biggest long-term impact on the quality of life of people in developing countries are things like the outputs of medical and agricultural research, investments in data for decision-making, social policy data in particular, and investments in both state and non-state institutions of accountability, including the media. And none of these things are going to figure very often in the ask that a government puts to a donor, or even the ask that communities put to donors. People's day-to-day concerns are more immediate, and governments are interested in what they need to deliver to their voters. This sort of background stuff is very high impact, and I think it's important that in a resource-constrained world, we recognise that these things are important and don't allow them to be, like humanitarian assistance at the moment, don't allow them to be swept aside quickly. And finally, just a sort of personal reflection. I mean, what I've been talking about what you invest in, but how you invest is important too. And over the years, I spent in starting with ADAB, then AusAid, then DFAT, working on development. I guess I came round to the view that's been expressed by some here that aid that's managed by third parties, aid that's programmed in accordance with rigid designs, generally doesn't work well. Not always. And what works best is really building on initiatives that already exist before you came along. And you could say that's localization, but not always. Often these initiatives do involve pre-existing international cooperation. There are hundreds of examples, but a good one is the PNG Institute of Medical Research, which has long-standing relationships with several Australian medical research institutions. And we in DFAT came along and invested in those, and with good results. And I think the how, in my view, should generally involve, building on what's there. Don't walk in and tell people this would be good for you, and these people over here will help you to do that. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Robin. That sounds like almost like a testimonial for RDI, doesn't it? So thank you. So Matthew, just bring that to the NGO level. And I mean, we've been talking about locally led development, and that's been pretty core to most of the NGOs that are your members. But do these changes require NGOs to think about their identities and roles in new ways? And in this context, what do you see as the role of Australian NGOs, and where might they most add value?
Yeah, no, it's a big question. And I think, the short answer is definitely yes. Need to rethink and continue to be on that journey, which I alluded to, that many of our members are, thinking about how do you truly be locally led? How do you truly decolonize some of your systems? I do think starting from an asset-based point, or, where the strengths, we did a survey of our members this year, the State of the Sector report. It was one of the breakout sessions in this conference. And what we found was of our members, 27% of them had partnerships at the local level that were at least 10 years in length, and 20% of our members had partnerships that were at least 20 years in length. And I think when we talk about allyship, or how do you actually partner well, it's predicated on relationship. And there's a lot of long-standing connections and relationships from the NGO community in Australia to community-based organizations around the world, actually. So I think there's something to build on there. I think Joe mentioned systems and how you think about changing the way that you work, and a lot of our members have done some creative things along those lines, and there's more to be done. How do you start at the governance level and think about, well, who's sitting at the board table and making decisions? How representative is that board of the Global South or of your partners, and what are different ways of thinking of governance? How do you change your decision-making systems and your power structures, and even your funding mechanisms in terms of block funding versus tied funding? And also thinking about the question of compliance, which comes up regularly. And in fact, it's a frustration that Australian NGOs talk a lot about, is how much time they spend and the burden of compliance. But that's even, I think, more true as we talk to our local partners and hear them talk about the burden of compliance and how that can be distracting from the work of actually that they are created to do in terms of the development programs. So I think there's a few things there to think differently about, and I think there's some good things and some innovative things that are happening. I think one of the things that's a challenge for organizations culturally, and this is a challenge for boards, is often success is seen as growing and getting bigger, and your budget or your bottom line is how you know if you're doing well. And so boards will drive NGOs to say, well, how do we increase revenue? How do we get bigger? How do we have more? And in some ways, that's counterintuitive to this idea of truly being locally led. And I think that's the future shift. That's the future trajectory for many and global North NGOs. And that is actually, how do we become smaller so that local partners can become bigger and more effective? And what does becoming smaller look like? ACVID's has partnered with a gentleman named Dylan Matthews, who works with Peace Direct. They published a report a few years ago, which was called Time to Decolonize Aid. And if you haven't seen that, it's worth looking at. It's kind of a seminal work in terms of thinking about decolonization and the challenges for the NGO and development sector. But they also published something more recently, which was called The 9 Roles That Intermediaries Can Play in International Cooperation. Again, I'd encourage you to Google that. It's on their website. But they talk about what does the future of Global North NGOs potentially look like if you're really committed to localization and decolonization. And there are 4 that I wanted to call out that I think are the future for Australian NGOs as well. One is to think of yourselves as an advocate or an amplifier. How do you raise voices and how do you advocate to change systems that are actually creating the challenges of poverty and injustice around the world? So shifting the focus to just funding flows and more to how do we change the systems? What does it mean to advocate? And the SDG framework, the big shift with the SDGs from the MDGs was the MDGs were all about how do we fund to solve problems in other places where poverty exists. And the SDGs were actually a much more, as Sharon was saying, inclusive model of saying, what do we have to do in Australia? What do we have to do in every country to actually build a more sustainable world? And so I think thinking about how we advocate and amplify is important. Another role they talked about for Australian NGOs or Global North NGOs is as a watchdog. And in my work with Tier Fund, we worked with a lot of organizations in places where civil society was really being constrained, and authoritarian governments were actually kind of crushing the voice of civil society. So what's the role that organizations like in Australian NGOs can play to actually help to be a watchdog and protect those rights and speak up as civil society might be oppressed or persecuted? One example of that was, work that we were doing in a country in Southeast Asia with an indigenous community who was trying to speak up for the rights of their forest. And they were facing incredible persecution and death because of political persecution. So how do we actually speak up and help to be an advocate and a watchdog? And I guess the final one I'll mention, just in the interest of time, is how do you be a critical friend? So an organization that can be a sounding board, that can accompany, that can give input. We're just in the process. Next week, I'm going to be in Fiji, and we're putting together work on the COP31 summit, the climate COP, which hopefully Australia and the Pacific will be getting. The decision hasn't been made yet, but we've been working with our counterparts, Piango, the Pacific peak body, and my counterpart, Siale there, on pulling together a summit to say, how do we bring Australian NGO and Pacific Island civil society voices together? What's the message we want to bring to this next COP? And I think it's given us a little bit of a case study and a model of how do you do that sort of cooperation and that allyship and that critical friend role well by handing the organizing to our partners at Piango and saying who should be at the table, how do we make sure that voices are equally represented, how do we set the agenda and let them lead the way. But Siale has been really clear as we've been doing this. Her view is it's not us organizing it so that you can attend, but we need to do this in partnership because only together are we actually going to be tackling these challenges. So those are a few thoughts.
Thanks, Matthew. And Sharon, I want to come to you and in this question, and this will be the last question from me before we get to the questions from the audience. So please go and upvote so that we know what to ask. But Sharon, in your role in the higher education sector and your role as a social scientist, you're obviously interested in strategic planning and decision-making under uncertainty, and some would argue all decision-making is under uncertainty. But could you just talk about the role of evidence in helping us to better understand and adapt to this changing environment that we've heard about?
So it's an interesting one because over the past 5 years, I also have this scientific advisory role with the UN. And when we go to the meetings with, top UN officials sometimes in those meetings, but also with a lot of country level policymakers, they always keep asking about these game changers in the context of sustainable development. So tell us, what are the game changers? It has become really a buzzword among UN circles. And, initially when I heard that question, and my colleagues as well, we were a little bit taken back. Oh, actually, what are the game changers? But then when you think carefully about it, actually the game changers are pretty known. We know some of the game changers. If we think about climate policy, for example, and climate action, carbon pricing, we know that it works. There's ample evidence on that. But good luck getting that on the policy agenda in Australia. So it's not really, when we talk about evidence, it's not much about always evidence of what works. It's actually about the key roadblocks in different contexts. And how do we actually develop tailored pathways relevant for that particular context in order to overcome those roadblocks so that the evidence can then shine and speak and find its way to the policy agenda. Because if you think about, a service-based economy, for example, it's probably not too difficult to get something like carbon pricing on the agenda. But if you are living in a fossil fuel economy, relying on fossil fuels, then it's a completely different story. So I think what we have been advocating for is that let's identify the context, identify the particular roadblocks, and the competing interests as well, that really those opposing narratives that often also oppose the evidence, and try to identify what can be done in that particular context in order to still achieve the outcomes that we want, but in a way that is more doable. And it's not easy. It's a very difficult job to do. But I think that's probably the way we need to think about evidence rather than a generalized view on evidence is probably not going to help us.
Thanks, Sharon. So we might now go to the questions from the audience, and thank you for those. The first one relates to the question about the impact of the development assistance and on the most vulnerable and marginalized communities. So it's about widening the inequality gap. And the questioner asked, it seems donors have continued to drift towards economic development objectives, leaving people most impacted, vulnerable, marginalised behind. This seems apparent in the way different actors are defining local. Does this risk further widening inequality, and where in the emerging development landscape are the resources to ensure that no one's left behind? There's a corollary to some of the things we've discussed, but it'd be great to hear from all of you on this. But would anyone like to start? Yeah, please.
I think just going back to this idea of the way that we work being just as important as what we do, I think that the integration of considerations of inclusion across all of our work has strengthened, at least in terms of at the policy level and at the programming level. The emphasis on gender inclusion, on disability inclusion and action, and broader social inclusion has continued to remain a focus. So I think that we should recognise that and celebrate that as a really important and key entry point to thinking about ensuring that the vulnerable and disadvantaged are not left behind, are a target of what is being taken forward. I think, however, that it's the translation of that into whatever it is you're doing and ensuring that, again, that it's being locally led, because it needs to be completely culturally attuned. It cannot be a donor-driven agenda. It cannot be a checkbox exercise. And really getting that right takes a lot more investment, a lot more thought, a lot more creativity than perhaps some of the approaches we're seeing. So, and I think that in the context of where all of this is being challenged and there's global backlash to a lot of these concepts and ideas, that remains critically important that we don't take our foot off the pedal there and ensure that we're continuing to evolve our approaches and thinking in this area.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in there. I was debriefing with somebody who was at the Finance for Development conference a week or so ago in Spain, and talking, just about the reflections on what the focus had been in some of the key discussions. And I suppose a concern as the global ODA budgets contract is that some of the ways of thinking are that, we'll find new financing mechanisms that will not necessarily reach the poorest of the poor, but be more attuned to, might be more focused on things like infrastructure projects or things that are a little more palatable for that sort of finance, or for private sector financing as well. So I think governments and NGOs are going to need, and philanthropists will need to continue to have an eye on how do we actually continue to ensure that the programs that we're funding and the new ways to source funding as well, that we're not just looking for the quantum of where the money is, but actually thinking about, is it going to reach the people in the most need in the countries? And I think, there's going to be a continued, I suppose, one of the things that ACFID has advocated for many years and will continue to advocate for is that we do move away from this idea that that our ODA budget in Australia is purely a geostrategic, a tool which drives you to the Pacific and away from places like Africa, where, if you look at all the trajectory of where poverty is going to be at its most extreme in the next decade, we know that's going to be in Africa, not in the Pacific. And so there should be at least some reflection as we're spending our aid budget, if it's truly about aid and bringing about development impacts, thinking about these other parts of the world that aren't necessarily reflecting our simply a geopolitical or military interest.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I've never done a sort of control F on the word poverty in Australia's current international development strategy, but I'm guessing you get about 0 to 2 hits somewhere in that. Right. So, the question is fair enough. It's interesting. But on the other hand, there's no obvious reason why a program strongly motivated by geostrategic concerns should not also be quite strongly focused on poverty reduction and poor communities in partner countries. because at least in our case, most of our neighbours, all of our near neighbours are democracies. We can give those governments what they want, and often what they want is to maximise their votes, and that means reaching all sections of the community as far as possible. So why doesn't this always happen? It's hard. We don't like to speak down to communities in the way we used to. We don't go on about the poorest of the poor. And often these strategic documents are addressing, the minister's cabinet colleagues or the Australian community as much as they are communities in partner countries. So I think maybe the question overstates the problem a little bit, but there is some truth to it. And I think it boils down to it being very hard, particularly with constrained administrative resources, to design and run programs that genuinely do have impacts on the poorest sections of the community.
I can bring just an SDG lens into this. And one of the key challenges when we are also using a framework like the SDGs to really look at these issues is the fact that when we report on progress on different goals and targets under the SDGs, there is often this aggregated level understanding of where we are in different areas. And if you look at it at a more granular level, you really see that actually the story, it could be potentially way, way worse for some sections of society, some particular groups within societies. And one of the things that we have also been trying to advocate for is that in thinking about also the future agenda, post-2030 in particular, what are the ways where we can actually provide a more disaggregated view and make sure, because one of the principles of the SDGs was this leave no one behind. But what does it actually mean in practice, and how is it actually represented in the goals and the way we track progress and we report against progress on the goals? And I think we keep saying that we need to be focusing on the goals that are lagging furthest behind with a focus on those people who are also the furthest behind on those goals. And I think this is a key, this should be a key consideration for the future, at least, if not in the next 5 years, in the lifespan of the SDGs.
Thanks, Sharon. So the next question relates to something we've heard a bit about both on the panel and certainly through the conference, about the theories of change, and just about the question is, there are diverse actors who may have different perspective on how change happens. What does this mean to perspectives on theories of change to achieve sustainable development goals and convening collective action to achieve?
I think one of the key works that needs to be done in the next 5 years, and it has already been happening, but needs to really accelerate so that we can move towards developing a stronger theory of change for the future agenda, is to really understand how different local actors have been or not been using the SDGs as a framework to guide their actions and decisions. The ones that have been using, in what way, and what has been the effects? Are they seeing any benefit and potential in using this framework? And the ones that aren't using them, what are the issues? What are the challenges? Why do they not engage? And the questions we ask and the kind of answers that we can get through this process might be slightly different for different societal actors, but we can also see some areas where there might be some convergence. And I also think that it is also possible that we might think about different theories of change for the SDGs, depending on at what level we are implementing them and thinking about implementation. I think there needs to be some sort of connection between them, and they have to be able to speak with each other. But it is very possible that at different levels, when we talk about all local level all the way to the international level, that we actually see different theories of change playing out on the ground. So it's really what we really need to do is to understand what has happened in the past 10 years and learn from that in order to really inform that future thinking about the theory of change.
Thanks, Sharon. Others? Any comments? No?
I think everything's been said about theories of change, but I guess one of the most absurd things about them as they figure in development is that they are generally produced by someone who appears from outside the context for a short period of time, disappears, and then somebody else is meant to ensure that the theory is true, which is immediately anti-scientific, and is not allowed to discard it and adopt alternative approaches as a program continues. So I'm not sure anyone who actually works in development thinks it's a good idea, and the mystery is why the whole concept persists. It's like something out of engineering from the 1960s. But
Thanks. Okay, we might move on to the Matthew, did you want to? No? So the next question is particularly relates to the discussion we had earlier, and we heard from Matthew about the Pacific and COP31, but how do we reconcile the tensions between seeing international development as a tool of diplomacy with the moral and ethical imperatives to respond to the climate crisis in the Pacific?
Can you just phrase the question again?
Yeah, so it's how do we reconcile the tension between, on the one hand, seeing international development as a tool of diplomacy with the moral and ethical imperatives to respond to the climate crisis in the Pacific? So it's very much at the heart of what you were saying earlier, Matthew, about COP31.
I suppose I don't necessarily agree that there has to be a dichotomy there. There can be, for sure. I mean, there can be different objectives and different reasons for doing it. I think it would be hard, I think for our politicians, I mean, Robin mentioned it's unlikely the Pacific would face cuts should the aid budget get cut just because of the diplomatic and geopolitical reasons. But also, and we've heard this throughout the conference, but anyone who's worked in the Pacific and talked to partners in the Pacific or leaders in the Pacific, their number one priority for Australia is climate. And so I don't think, and in talking to politicians as well, they hear that. So I think actually in this regard, I don't necessarily think there's a dichotomy. There's probably a bigger question about whether our nation is committed to addressing the challenges of climate change and what that actually means in terms of the changes domestically that we would have to make and do and commit to. And certainly that's as I listen to our colleagues from the Pacific, that would be where I hear the biggest critique of hypocrisy, where we're not actually taking those actions, or we're saying how much we are committed to addressing climate in the Pacific, but not actually changing the systems here in Australia that that drive that. So mining, et cetera. So yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's mainly a question of scale. I mean, you can use aid as a tool of diplomacy fairly effectively with not a whole lot of money, as long as you are doing more than the next guy. The next guy being China, who has moved away to some extent from loan financed investments toward what it's describing as small and beautiful grant investments. So in a way, from a diplomatic perspective, Australia just needs to do a bit better than that. But to address the challenges of climate change, it's going to have to do a lot better than that. So I think it's a scale thing.
Other comments? No? So yeah, the next question is about, and Robin, you touched on the nexus between humanitarian development and peace building, but it would be good to get some thoughts on the future of the nexus approach, as humanitarian assistance obviously should be short-term, but frequently is not, especially in a protracted crisis. We've not yet touched on this link between humanitarian development and peace building.
Look, I'm happy to jump in there again. I think that has been, just if you look over the last decade of development work, certainly that nexus has been one of the big changes. I think, the word in one of the, I forget what session it was, that we were talking about polycrises, and the fact that, if you go back, when I first landed in Africa and was in a very remote rural village, we were in a community that was facing a drought and all the challenges around a drought. And I would say at that point in time, the way that a lot of humanitarian crises happened, they happened for a season, whether it be a conflict or a drought, and you address that, and then that was resolved, and you could get back to funding and focusing on longer-term development outcomes. And certainly the big shift, I would say, over the last decade is that there isn't such a clear nexus of, okay, now the crisis is over and we can get on to development, because we just have all these overlapping crises that have been happening, and hence the word polycrises, be it, the challenges of climate change, be it the challenges of health and COVID, the conflicts that have had impacts on food security in parts of Africa, and the economic crisis globally and cost of living. So all of these things layered on top. So when we're thinking about the communities that we're working with, inevitably, as you're thinking about development, you're thinking about humanitarian, and there isn't actually this clean divide. So, and the other big reality and challenge, as we talk about cuts to the humanitarian aid system, and the point being made that actually that often is the piece of budgets that's easier to cut, because it is discretionary in the sense that it's for a future conflict or disaster that we may not know what that is. But because these are ongoing, they don't just start and stop, they're ongoing. The need to actually be thinking about integrating our funding decisions and our thinking about our budgets in a much more, as I say, integrated way.
Thanks, Matthew. Now, I've got one final question from the audience before I ask a sort of a closing question of you all, where you can solve, this is your chance to solve the whole thing, the whole conference. But this last question, I couldn't resist asking this one, and perhaps Sharon in particular. What are the panel members' views on the roles of Australian universities in the evolving landscape? Obviously, universities going through their own turmoil at the moment, but Australian universities do graduate hundreds of thousands of international students each year, represent over $60 billion of investment per annum. Where might they be best utilised for improving development outcomes? So, yeah, a small question, but Sharon, if we...
I think the answers are probably, I probably don't have any transformative answer to that question. They're a little bit cliche in terms of both, if you look at education, really, that's where people come and people go from that university experience to taking up roles in their countries in different places. And we have already seen really big leaders graduating from Australian universities and taking up big roles and doing things in great ways sometimes. I guess in terms of research, perhaps that's where, and mind you, on education, I think one of the things that we have also kept talking about, at least at our own university, Monash University, is that we think education for sustainable development needs to be kind of like a blanket education for anyone who comes through the university system, because whether you're an engineer or a social scientist or a medical doctor, whatever you want to be, you need to have some basic understandings of what sustainable development is and what does it mean in your particular sector and field, and how to do better as a doctor, as an engineer, as a social worker, etc., in terms of sustainable development. So I think if we could do something on that, we could probably do a better job. But I think when it comes to research and the way we do research, I think there are really key things to be done. And I don't think that the current trends that we're seeing in many Australian universities is actually moving towards that direction. There was a lot of activity happening around, more impact-oriented work a few years ago, and a lot of universities taking up, leadership for sustainability and sustainable development as well. But in the past couple of years, I think probably after COVID and with the budgets shrinking a little bit in many of the universities, we see that there's a little bit of a backward trend, and some of those things being ramped up or downscaled, which is really unfortunate, I guess.
Thanks. So unless there are any other comments on that, I might, yeah, please.
Just a
Rob.
really quick one. I mean, I'm not an academic, I'm just parked at a university, but of course the Australian National University for a long time has had quite deep links with the University of the South Pacific and the University of Papua New Guinea, partly because people there were educated at the ANU and then continued to have links as time went by. And right now there are some quite formal capacity building relationships between these institutions. So I think that's really important to look for. I mean, Australian universities shouldn't go wandering around looking for people's capacity to build, but where something grows organically like that's an example of what I was talking about earlier that I think can be usefully built on. It was beginning to happen in Myanmar before the coup, for example. It had a strong university system, and I hope things open up again there in the future. And the point's a bit broader than unis as well. It can be scientific research institutions of all sorts.
Great. Thanks, Robert. Well, this brings us to a final question for all the panelists, where we get a chance for you to synthesize and ask, what are your top 3 things we should be doing right now to prepare for the future that we've heard so much about both in this session, but also in the conference as a whole? The top 3 things. If I could perhaps go in order, and Jo, if you could start.
Sure. So my first one is to support local leadership, particularly emerging local leadership. And I think there's lots of different ways that you can do that, either as an individual or an organisation. I think secondly, investing in the narrative and the communication of that narrative and fostering greater understanding of what this whole development caper is all about. And thirdly, I think if you are part of any organisation in this space, I think you should be assuming change and planning for change, and not assuming that any status quo is going to remain in the future.
I should say I was a little bit surprised in this conference that there was, of course, a lot of talk about locally led development, but the interface between development, and particularly locally led development, and sustainable development, or the SDGs, was very weak. I think the only times I actually heard the word SDGs was when Matthew French opened the conference and said that we are behind on the SDGs. And then the second time was in this session where we talked about the SDGs. I talked about the SDGs. I actually think that one of the reasons, I mean, there should be multiple reasons for that, but one of the things also, I think, with the current developments that are happening in the world of human practitioners and the kind of urgent issues that they're grappling with, maybe that is shifting the focus a little bit, and we have seen this with COVID in the past as well, that a lot of the narratives around the SDGs and sustainable development shifted towards crisis management, and let's just get us out of this crisis situation that we are in at. So I would say my number one would be, when we talk about development, let's really talk about sustainable development, not just development. The second thing is, I guess, again, in the context of what we are facing in the world, and many people have said it in this conference, I just want to highlight the opportunity also for regional collaboration. And in that, I want to also really hope and see that Australia really steps up to the role it can play as an enabler for sustainable development in the region. Particularly, Australian government itself hasn't been particularly interested in the SDGs, but the government in the Asia Pacific are, and they're deeply interested in the SDGs. They talk about the SDGs. They set up institutions for achieving and implementing the SDGs. So really, I would like to see Australia really stepping up, both domestically, but also thinking about its role in the region in this regard.
I'm going to keep it personal and think about individually, what can we do, or how can we, what are the three things? One of the breakout sessions yesterday was looking at what are the incremental things, or what are the things that each of us individually can bring to our institutions, the projects we're involved with, that can further those journeys on commitments to things like decolonization and locally led, and all the things we've been talking about that are good, pushing us in the right direction. So what are the questions we can ask? What are the things we can push against? What are the systems that we can change where we are? I think that's something to take away and not lose sight of. I think as well, I'm wearing a pin that says the Safer World for All. It's a campaign that the sector's been involved with for the last over a year now, just one of our many campaigns, but talking about why caring about international development, international aid matters, and raising our voice. Australia did not cut their aid budget this year when many other governments around the world did. And that's notable. We still, in real terms, have gone backwards and are actually at the lowest level we've ever been in the history of our aid program. So while we didn't cut, we haven't grown. And part of that is that there isn't enough voice saying to our government and to our leaders that actually we care about this. And that's, again, something each of us can be a part of and raise our voices. But the last thing, and I think it's maybe the most important thing, especially when you do the work that we all do and face the challenges that we all face, is think about where we find hope. Because I think hope is such an important part of why we go to work each day, why I do anyway, and I think why we continue to do the work that we do. And we can lose sight of that, especially as we're grappling with these big challenges. If almost every way you look at development measurements around the world, whether it be access to education, whether it be poverty levels, whether it be access to water, if you look over the last 20 years, we're better off than we were 20 years ago. We actually have made progress in many areas. There's lots that we still need to do. There's lots of challenges, but the system has delivered. There are positive things that have happened, and we can lose sight of that, and especially, as I said, as we face the challenges. But when you take it to the individual level, you can lose sight of it as well. And one of the sessions today was some leaders from the Pacific talking about the programs that they had done. And one of the women was just talking about this local community education program that she'd been involved with. And she said that community for the first time went from the most kids that had ever gone from year 9 on was 9. And after that project, it was 12. It seems like a small number, but that's change. That's hope. That's reason to say, actually, this is worth doing what we're doing. I mentioned that I'm corresponding with someone who's in the Cox's refugee camps, and I was really moved by the message they sent me last week, and it wasn't one that I had expected, but he was just saying, well, how we still find hope in the midst of all of the challenges that we're facing. And the hope is in the community. The hope is in the sense that, this isn't the end point and that the world can be different. And if he can find hope in that context, certainly we can too. And there's really power in hope and bringing that narrative to the work that we do and as we talk about the work that we do. So anyway, hopefully we can take some hope.
Thank you. Two quick comments on Australia's aid cuts. The way I think of it is we were early adopters. Australians are always early adopters. We did it in 2014. But at least we've sort of stabilised. And there are SDG stickers all over 255 London Circuit in Canberra, so we must be taking them seriously. My three things just really quickly. I think number one, in looking at bilateral aid, I've kind of said this a couple of times, less projectized aid, more budget support associated with policy dialogue around some of those things that we talked about, including social inclusion. Secondly, support for those things, and these are prescriptions, I guess, for any donor, but particularly Australia, but support for those other things I talked about that are not so much demanded directly by partners, but are very important in leveraging development impact, support for a free media, for social science research, data for decision-making, and medical and agricultural research. There are other things, but those are some of the big ones. And finally, Australia doesn't play a very prominent or active role on the multilateral stage anymore. It occasionally says it's doing so, for example, in relation to the humanitarian protection of humanitarian workers. This is all good, but we're approaching a period where the multilateral development system is going to go through a large upheaval, and Australia should have large interests in developing positions on how that upheaval should go. If institutions have to merge, or mandates have to change, or governance has to change, Australia should be playing an active role for the benefit of the countries in our region and working closely with them.
Thanks very much. Well, we've come to the end of the penultimate session of the RDI exchange. So it remains for me to thank everyone here who's engaged with this session, to thank the organisers for generally for putting on such a fantastic event, but specifically for inviting such a wonderful panel for this session. And particularly if you could join me in thanking our panel for stimulating discussion.
I'll let them walk off stage. That was amazing, wasn't it? I feel very, very full. How do you feel? Full? Tired? So we want to just take some time to kind of create a bit of space for you, just to kind of sit with what you've heard just now and what you've heard over the last 2 days. Obviously, it takes some time for these things to settle down, but also it's kind of nice when we are together as a collective and to be together to sort of make sense of some of this together. So we wanted to sort of to digest together some of what we've heard and what experience you've had both today and also over the time you've been here. I've sort of counted up that you may have been part of today 2 keynote panels. Hands up if you were part of 2 keynote panels. Yeah. You may have attended 14 concurrent sessions if you were teleporting across the different rooms. Yesterday, you may have seen 1 keynote panel. Can everyone remember back to the keynote panel yesterday? And yesterday, you may have attended 20 concurrent sessions if you were teleporting around. You may have consumed 2 lunches. How many lunches did you consume? And potentially 6 cups of tea, which is a lot of cups of tea. So hopefully you've doing them. And you've thrown some dice. Who threw some dice yesterday? So you've thrown some dice. So you've done a lot over 2 days, a hell of a lot. We're going to put a next slide up. I think, oh, there you go, the magic. So we just want to let you take some time just to reflect on your experience today and also yesterday. And one of the things we want to talk about as well is not just the talk, but also the action. Yesterday we were inspired to act, and our panelists just now talked about, what are the 3 takeaways? What are the things that we can do, both individually, organisationally, at the systems level? So just take some time to reflect on one of these questions that might resonate for you now. You can take some time to write on one of the cards in the table, and just take some time and share with each other. What are some actions that you want to take based on your time here over the last 2 days? Ooh, little background music there. Nice. We're going to get some mood music for you. Background music just to...
The drinks is that type of thing, or
Yeah. And have a conversation with some people around you. What do you want to do based on your time here?
you enjoyed the instrument?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's been, and I at a lot of levels, and I don't think I expected this much fulfillment out of the sessions that I attended, but it was really nice to hear different perspectives on humanitarian aspects of the really technical work that people do. Particularly intriguing was Sienna and how she's developed it. When I was doing development, and her views on empowerment and how it's in fact that defined and worked me developing and what is the word that's true for them what it means to be developing we know about things and we kind of just start learning and getting what we learned at that academic. And I think just fresh time in rewire my brain and think about things. I think it's really, really enriching and an inspiration. Yeah. Maybe define things that actually do that have reality and fit impact. I also sustainability into the buzzword. What are we doing now? I researched and built on slavery and the construction supply chain. And I think I've referred to one by a 1060s time and again. But more like a general view on what's objective, what's needed, but not like a, you know, it's not really a framework, it's not making by it's not strength, that gives you a how to buy. And the fact that they will I think oh yeah. I just wish that we had confidence to stating something that knowledge the world is amazing. And it's found that it's like, you know, bunch of people who turned out to be great and it has to be out there. Look at some of it. Because it has how to be effective. And I don't think I mean, that I've heard that there are things that being public. Yeah, but then maybe using them how there's like all right. And we would expect quite a lot of people to be in then we would bringing my meals really and it's fair enough and you like keep it's really rare that people
Okay. Ring my bell. Thank you so much, everyone. It's good to, even at the end of like 2 intense days, you're still talking. You've got so much stamina. I don't know how you do it. So yeah, thanks so much. I'm going to hand over to Matthew, who's just going to formally close and then invite us for drinks.
All right. These kind of events, as we know, don't just happen overnight. They are months and months of careful planning. So I'm looking around the organizing committee. Can you stand up? I hope you're in the room. Stand up if you're on the organizing committee. Come to the front. Come on, you've worked for weeks and months. Come on, come on, come on. Come to the front. You've got to see who's put this incredible event together. These are the superstars that have volunteered and put enormous time and energy into making this exchange a success. Still a couple more coming or missing? No? So back in sort of December, we said, imagine if we got like 100 people, or maybe we could even get 150 people, you know, from maybe like 5 or 6 countries. Well, we've got over 300 from over 25 countries. So it's a massive achievement, massive achievement. And a particular shout out to the wonderful two in the middle, Karen Winterford and Liz Jackson, who are the co-chairs. So please, as we head out for canapes and drinks, which are going to be served out where we've been having lunch, go and say thanks to these amazing people, Connect, and the broader UTS team as well. Thanks to our sponsors, obviously, who without this wouldn't have happened, particularly DFAT and our host, University of Technology Sydney, Institute for Sustainable Futures. Clap for them. And we reserve the biggest clap for you guys, yourselves, people who have come here from all around the world. So with that, we'll close the Exchange 2025. Please stay if you can, have a drink, have a canapé, meet, mingle, and connect. And yeah, thank you for an amazing 2 days, everyone. Thank you. Incredible.